In studio by analyst Nixon Katembo, who is also with the SABC's Channel Africa Radio. Nixon, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've been here listening to the discussion that we're having with Sarah with regards to everything that's happened in Kenya to date. The opposition NASA coalition led by Raila Odinga has basically walked out with the Jubilee party, which is Uhuru Kenyatta's party, calling for changes in the law to ensure that the nullification of elections are not done again, and what they're going through currently never happens again. What's your take on this?
Perhaps we need to look at how issues are unfolding in Kenya. One, the greater issue of politicking among politicians themselves in Kenya, and where they are taking the country at the moment. The question is, do they think that the country is moving forward with politicking, or do they think that there should be an open line of negotiations on how to take the country forward and take the country out of the political quagmire that it finds itself now? The question that arises from that is that the processes that have been outlined within the legal framework of the Kenyan constitutions, it states clearly that there should be elections within 60 days if the elections are annulled, as the Supreme Court did. But what we find so bizarre in the whole political saga that is happening in Kenya now is how both the side of the political aisle are bickering instead of sitting down and finding a solution to what is facing the country at the moment.
Why do you think there's so much bickering? And just going back to 2007, where we saw similar, there was protests, there was violence, people lost their lives. Economically, Kenya being one of the strong economic hubs in the eastern region, why should Kenya, such a strong powerhouse in that East African region, go through so much turmoil to find leadership or to continue with the proper governance of a country? Well,
the problem in Kenya did not start with the 2007 elections. The problem in Kenya is systemic in itself, right from the independence. If you look at the historical political trajectory that Kenya has gone through from independence up until to where it is today, there are underlying factors that has not been resolved that keep coming back on the political scene even when they try to resolve the system. For one, Kenyan independence was delayed simply because Jaramogi Odinga, who was the father of the current opposition leader Raila Odinga, requested the British government to delay the Kenyan independence, waiting for the release of Jomo Kenyatta, who had been held at the time by the colonial government. Upon the release of Jomo Kenyatta, these two guys who were initially friends couldn't get along, and there the problem started. Even though they came together, the first elections of 1961 held under the colonial government, which was then the core council of governors, which had 63 seats. Out of those 63 seats, 20 actually were reserved for the Europeans, 8 were reserved for Indians, and the other seats were reserved for, 45 seats were reserved for so-called black African, because we have to understand the historical perspective of Kenya, that it's a country which might have a colonial history in as much as Africa has. So that's where the problem started. In 1963, when they first held the first democratic elections that led after the independence, KANU, which was formed then bringing all these liberation movement together, they held the elections. The parliament had been extended, and the creation of the Senate already in place, which had about 149 representatives. KANU won was the majority of those seats. Going forward, they couldn't understand each other, And 1966, there was a breakaway, Kenya People's Union, which was led by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and the likes of Tom Mboya and all these other who differ with the Kenyatta. So you see that political changes carry on from independence up until the current democratic dispensation was introduced in the early 90s. So Kenya is a very interesting place that we continue to watch from the political scenes, but the underlying factors are still lingering, even the democratic dispensation that Kenya is witnessing.
Now, Nixon, you've been focusing a lot on Kenya and understanding everything that's going on there, and I'm sure you've had discussions with other experts as well with regards to Kenya. Where to from now? That history that you've just given us about where it all started, is this more of personality clashes? Is there a personal issue that needs to, maybe for the two leaders of the NASA coalition, Odinga and Kenyatta, to sit down, just the two of them, to hash things out and then be able to come out and bring their parties together and then move forward from that? What are other experts saying with regards to Kenya? What needs to be done going forward? Indeed,
they see the same thing. We're both worried about how the Kenya is going. But the most important thing is for these political parties to come together and put the country forward. Unfortunately, that is not happening, simply because those political parties that are ruling now, the NASA coalition, the Jubilee coalitions, are in as much led by two sons of former leaders who differed during independence, post-independence, and now they're still differing. So it's sort of the Kenyatta dynasty and the Raila Odinga dynasty, historical narrative and the political clashes playing out at the moment. And unfortunately, it had brought ethnic polarization in the country. We saw the 2007 elections happening. So the question is more of the political figures rather than the systems, because running to these elections, there were a raft of changes in terms of electoral law and how to handle these elections, the transmission of the result, which led actually to the nullification of the results by the Supreme Court. So as long as these political leaders cannot sit down and get together and say, here we are, we have political differences, but we have a country to run. The country needs to move forward. The country needs to be beyond our political interest. And that's the major point.
Now, Nixon, we've seen the walkout by Raila Odinga's NASA coalition today with regards to the laws that Uhuru Kenyatta wants to implement to ensure that a nullification by the Supreme Court of an election never takes place again. Now, with this walkout, do you think talks, a sit down, will ever happen? And the call by the opposition, the NASA coalition, for protests on Mondays and Fridays?
By the way, this is nothing new in the Kenyan politics. We have seen it before when the Independent Electoral Commission was called IBC, was said to be being a bad referee in Raila's words. They called for mass actions every Monday, but those mass actions never yield the result, because now it seems the Kenyan people are tired of politicking. They are tired of what is happening, and I think it's now up to now for the politician to realize that this is not what we should be doing. We should focus on building our country. We should focus on bringing the lives of the people to a certain degree of prosperity and moving the country forward. Now, what we see quite often is the politicians says one thing on the other hand and do the other things on the other hand. I will paint one aspect. Raila Odinga said that we're going to boycott parliament because Uhuru Kenyatta is not constitutionally president anymore. Yes. But we
he
saw
was in
them
Parliament.
getting into getting into Parliament and actually participating in the activities of Parliament. So there is a high level of politicking rather than getting to actual running of the state institutions and making sure that there is stability in that country.
Now, October 26, not too far off, the two parties changing of law and calling for protests, and as you say, this has been seen before. Now, with regards to the amendment of the law and ensuring that a nullification never happens again in an election, has this ever happened? Is this new to Kenya? Or is this something likely going to change, you know, the governance of Kenya going forward?
Well, this is nothing new. I think Kenya have witnessed a lot of changes. If there is any country that have witnessed so many electoral reforms in the democratic dispensation post Berlin fall on 1990, when democracy was introduced formally on the African continent, Kenya has seen so many raft of changes. And these changes, unfortunately, always play in the hands of the incumbent. And we've seen that not only Kenya, it happens in Rwanda. You saw what is happening on a TV screen, what is happening in Uganda at the moment.
Yes.
So I think the question is, do we understand what are democratic processes in moving our countries forward on the continent? That's the question we should be asking ourselves. And as long as leaders still think that they have a birthright to lead or birthright to be opposing everything, I think that will be a challenge. And if you look at what the bill that was introduced today comes as a result of constitutional, the Supreme Court nullification of the elections. But what is the ruling party picking here? It's saying that the elections were nullified on the technicalities of the transmission of results. Fair enough. It's saying that the number were not disputed. Some are saying they should have ordered for a recount of the election because it's a physical ballot that get counted and then transmitted electronically. But the question is, where do we go from here? Do we remain with the manual transmission of the results, or do they take electronic transmission result? And in any case, no elections ever been perfect. We saw it in the Bush 2000 in the United States. We saw it with Hillary Clinton and the Trump issues. And unfortunately, what now the Supreme Court ruling brings to the fore is a situation where the Kenyan elections are perfect. And to me, that perfections in any elections anywhere in the world might never happen.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Very interesting discussion, and I wish we could be able to take it further. And that was Nixon Katembo, who is also with SABC's Channel Africa Radio, speaking to us about the political situation in Kenya in the run-up to a rerun of the presidential poll.